I'm Christoph von Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for.
Hi, Daniel. It's really exciting to have you here today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
We go way back. I think we got to know each other in London at the Writer-Docs meetup. I think that's where we first met, right?
Yes, that's right.
And that was the crazy times before Corona, when I was still going once a month to London to organize a meetup there. Traveling from Belgium. I love those trips. And you were one of the regulars for the meetup. You did a lot of presentations. It's always really good to hear whatever you were working on. And then I met you at FullStack early this month. And you had this really interesting talk that I really wanted to get you on the podcast to dig a little bit deeper. But can you maybe, before we all dive into all of that, can you maybe just give a short introduction of who you are and what you're typically busy with, what's been your life journey? And then we can slowly start approaching the topic that you got the season of docs. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah. Of course. So I'm Daniel Beck. I am a freelance documentation consultant. I tell people I'm a technical writer, but a lot of my work it's one of those phrases that actually covers a lot of ground that's not just writing. And so I do a lot of tools and process work. I have a little bit of discomfort with it, but there's this phrase, docs engineering. I do a bit of that kind of thing, though I really think that's about the kind of the human element of it, right? Centralizing around tools, to bring people to produce documentation. So that's the kind of thing I do. I do some writing, and a lot of the work that I do is for clients that either they are producing open source software or they're producing documentation that is through an open source contribution model, or at least doing that work in public. And so that's the world that I'm going in right now. I came to that through a really kind of straight line. I'm the very rare technical writer who trained as a technical writer. So when I was a university student, I started out as a computer science student, and I decided, I want to be a writer. And I learned soon after that there was this at the university I went to, the University of Central Florida. There was this program in technical writing, and I was like, this is actually the right combination here. I've been through my whole career, I've been a writer, and definitely focused on developer audiences, tools and docs for developers. That's the kind of thing that I do.
I think it was fascinating hearing the story of how you actually started your career, that you were coming straight from university, or even while you were still at university, were I want to do documentation for open source software, which is, I think, a very rare thing, because I know how much in the open source world people are always looking for documentarians, people that like writing documentation. Join us, we're cool. You can write docs for us. That's great. But so that's a very rare bird, actually.
Yeah. It's funny. I told that anecdote in my FOSDEM talk about as a university student trying to get involved in open source documentation, and it was especially at the time, that was before stuff like the docs existed. I think actually even the kind of mentors that I had for tech writing, as a student, came from a very heavy industry kind of world where public utilities and aerospace and stuff that makes a lot of noise and is really expensive. And so I just didn't have, I knew from just being interested in software that open source existed, and it has a cool contribution model and everything. And I knew that software documentation was important, and I knew I wanted these things to fit together. But I think it took a long time for the pieces to come together, where I had the skills to be a contributor in that way, that the tools to do contributions, things like GitHub, they didn't always have the rich preview for Markdown and that sort of stuff. And then I think culturally, right? I think not as much as I would like, but I think we've gotten better as just for the software industry generally, recognizing that actually good documentation is really important. That if you can't see what to do with the code, a lot of code doesn't do you much good. In some ways, I have grown into this work at the same.
But the first thing that really piqued my interest when we were doing that talk at FullStem was like just the project you're doing is just fascinating. Can you tell a little bit more about the program that you're participating in, and then also what you're doing exactly?
Sure. There's this program that Google funds called Season of Docs, and what they do is they issue grants to open source projects to improve their documentation. And they've done a few rounds now of helping open source projects with their documentation, and that program has evolved over time. And they're trying to find ways to help those open source projects do more with those resources. And so the folks who organized that at Google got in touch with me and said, we want to build kind of resources to support that. So this wasn't a Season of Docs project, rather it was this project for Season of Docs.
Yeah.
and we had some really nice conversations, and we got to talking about there is this sort of lack of models or like role models, like behaviorally, like how you do it, but like also just examples to look to, where if you're an open source project, you're trying to rewrite some documentation or migrate to a new tool or a new website or all that kind of stuff. Lots of projects end up starting from scratch to turn that into a plan that they can execute on. And so we came up with this idea of trying to help structure those activities so that it's not just completely from scratch. And one of the interesting things about open source is that the situation that a project finds itself in can be highly variable. The kind of corporate IT documentation processes, they tend to look alike and have similar origin stories. Open source is like a really different situation. I think so much of that work is opportunistic. Someone comes along who has an interest in or the time to do some documentation work, or there is suddenly a funding opportunity for documentation work or what have you. And being able to grab one of those opportunities and turn that into something like into a project that you're actually working towards a completion that's a hard problem for open source. And I've started writing these documentation archetypes, which is, I don't know, or rather documentation project archetypes. This isn't about the actual literal content. There's some lovely projects out there like the Diataxis framework that will give you a sense of, here's how to like conceptualize a document. But this is more about the project that brings those documents about. So open source projects, they often come to doing documentation work through a lot of different avenues that from kind of the corporate IT world, that process often has very similar origin stories with the kinds of events that are going to trigger documentation work, where with open source projects, it's often the case that work happens because some opportunity presents itself. So you've got maybe a funding round, maybe you have a really interested contributor, maybe you reach that breaking point where you've gotten too many complaints about the documentation. It's finally time to do something about it. And because those projects rarely have a resident tech writer or information architect or content strategist or somebody with experience seeing a lot of those projects, a lot of those documentation projects, open source has a tendency towards inventing from scratch how they're going to do documentation for that project. And even on some of the projects that I've been involved in, I've been guilty of this too, right? Because you get a little bit fixated on the opportunity and not the consequence so much. So I've been writing these documentation archetypes. I swear once more of these are written, there'll be a better name for this. Something short and clever, but they describe patterns in organizing documentation work. And so it breaks down into a dozen-ish archetypes and recognizes what kinds of problems organizing this kind of documentation work can solve. What are the typical tasks, deliverables that are going to come out of that project, the circumstances under which you're going to do this project, the people you're going to need to have involved in it, the major risks that are common to that type of documentation work, and so that maybe you can plan to avoid them. And then some links to some resources that are going to be like informative guiding reading for that kind of work. And so that's at a high level. And these aren't super heavy, detailed descriptions. It's more like a spotter's guide. So that when you are finding yourself in that situation, you can draw a box around that work and start to orient yourself toward the completion of that work. And so that's at a high level. I could break down like one of these as an example or something.
I want to dig a little bit deeper, because so when you presented that at FOSDEM, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Because this, yes, it's really important for open source. This is not just open source, because
No.
when I talk to people in enterprises, there's never, ever enough documentarians. There's always lots and lots of documentation depth that companies have. And often or at least the parts that I'm involved in, like the API aspects and API documentation, developer portals and stuff like that, you typically have developer community that is working together on a set of APIs and document. And very rarely they have enough documentarians, or so often they don't have any documentarians at all. The same kind of problems that you see with open source projects, there I am sure that almost all of them are going to also exist in that space. And then if you have an organization that's trying to do inner sourcing, for sure it's going to be the same. So that's why I was like, this is amazing. Like, people need to hear about this, because I think it's going to help to, like, for product owners that are trying to run an API program, that are trying to get better documentation, that are not getting money for hiring enough technical writers. Hopefully they get at least one or two. You never know. Then these patterns might help. So that's why I got really excited. There was another reason, but we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
But can you talk about one of these patterns, like one that you could imagine also being useful inside of a large enterprise?
Sure. So actually, the one I presented is, I think, a familiar experience for a lot of people. And the name for this entry is the migration. And it covers work where you're switching from one tool to another to publish your documentation. Or you're switching from one static site generator to another. You're maybe moving content out of a content management system into a different content management system. Maybe moving to a different host for the actual deployment of your site, where most everything else is staying the same. It's that archetype. That's an experience. This is a good example, actually, of one that doesn't implicate the open sourceness of it in particulars there. So just to give you a bit of an example here, as written, there's a brief synopsis of this project, basically what I just told you. There's how this connects to other documentation project types. That kind of like migration work, like, you're probably not going to jump directly into that from a standstill, right? You're gonna have done an audit beforehand to find out like everything that needs to move, or you're going to have done a discovery or a prototype project where you've tested out a small subset with a new set of tools. There's different ways to approach that. And then there's follow-on projects, things you're going to do after you've done this, perhaps generating new documentation once you're in a better, more suitable tool. Then there's a kind of establishing the audience context for this, like who does this work deliver a benefit to? So for this kind of work, migration work, sometimes migration is invisible to your audience. It's solely for the contributors to that documentation. It could be that it is more outwardly facing, though. Maybe perhaps you move from a Linux machine stuffed in a closet somewhere to a CDN, and now the page loads are a lot faster for your readers. And so orienting a little bit around that, just to give some sense of who you're doing this for. And then I talk a bit about when you would do this kind of project. What are the kinds of problems that would exist where this would be a solution to that problem? After delving into this, after showing this off to some folks like at FOSDEM and afterward, I've got some good feedback. And one of the points was like, actually, we need to highlight some of the situations where this is not going to be the kind of work that you want to do.
Yes.
Like, one of the things I call out is there's a risk that somebody, often it's yourself, who wants to play with a new tool, and like the impetus is to try out this new thing or to adopt a favored tool or whatever. And we haven't established there's an audience involving aspect to this. Maybe don't do that. And so that's part of this when to do this project orienting. Then I break down the tasks and deliverables for that. And this is one of those things. This is why it's like an archetype and not a project plan, because there's going to be some things on your to-do list in a migration. Some will apply to every project, say backing up your existing documentation before you make the move. But like other things are going to depend on what the exact nature of that migration is. So it just calls out the kinds of tasks, not to give you a to-do list, but to help you decide what should go on that to-do list, so you don't forget anything, central to that. Did you want to chime in on that first?
For me, so this is all great, but for me, the most important part is that so it helps to create structure when you're doing
Yes.
this the first time. That's there, but I think what for me is even more important is that it creates pretenses to do better, to do more docs. Because you can look through this list and say, is there anything on this list that applies to us right now that I can actually get funding for, that it's not going to be said like, no documentation, we're not spending money on that. But there's this migration coming, and yes, like we need to spend money on that because otherwise it's going to be a problem. And that you can I think that you can look through the archetypes and look for sneaky ways that you can sneak in budgets for tech writers so that you can get better docs as an output. So that was one of the things I was excited about. Yeah.
And I guess that's like maybe a key point here is like the very next kind of section in the outline is key people. And there's actually lots of documentation work that if your idea of documentation work is a writer sits down and starts banging out words, like you're going to have a pretty like narrow closed view of what constitutes documentation work, but you're also just going to miss out on ways that you can improve your documentation through other kinds of activity, that resources you might already have, or places where writers and engineers, writers and marketers, writers and product management, all those folks can maybe come together in a way that is like, it's not 100% writing, it's 20% this, 20% that, and so on. And it's, I think that's to your point. You can find ways to like both get more resources, use the resources you already have, and to lever things open a little bit, where you can establish a relationship between documentarians broadly and other interested folks, that in ways that you might not have thought about if you were just thinking in terms of like, all right, and now this one person's going to go and sit in a corner and do this one thing.
Yeah, that's really exciting, I think. Just to be able to go through the overview of all the patterns that you found and then use that as like a template to start thinking about ways, like what applies to my context and how can I utilize this to get better docs as a result. So that's really exciting, I think. Yeah. So the other thing that immediately when you started talking about this, or like 5 minutes in your talk, I was like, pattern languages. This is pattern languages, because you were talking about patterns that you can go look for, and then how to actually execute them in the right way, in what context they apply, in what context they don't apply, and then how you actually go about what are the practices you need to have to be able to make it work. And so when after your talk, I came to you asking Christopher Alexander, and you're like, oh yeah. So have you thought further about the connections with that book? Yeah.
I have. Yeah. It's one of those things where it was such a light bulb moment when you mentioned it, because I was like, of course this is an influence. And it's such a cool book to like, to flip it open to a random page and go, oh yeah, like that's and I'm not an architect. I'm just a guy who has lived in a home, right? But it's fun to see where you go, oh yeah, that's something that's weird about where I live, and actually there are ways you can design around these problems. And I now that you mentioned this to me, I have this kind of seed planted. Oh yeah, I hope when open source documentation folks flip through this, that they're going to find those and go, oh, I never thought about solving that. So I have been thinking about the way that I write this in those kinds of terms of making it so that people can see their situation in it, like as clearly as possible. And it also got me thinking about the other things in this sort of genre that have influenced me. And so some are like more concretely toward this kind of model of just like of content work, right? There's a department of the US government, it's called 18F, and they do like kind of digital transformation stuff. And they have this site, it's Methods, it's just called Methods. And it calls out some like collaboration processes. And they've got some that are very familiar to me. Oh, comparative analysis and content audits and these kinds of things, site mapping. And they've got other ones that are like more from like maybe the world of like product management or whatever, but it's got a similar kind of style. Theirs are neat little cards, like they fit in one screen full, which I just have a ton of for. There's also the design patterns book. It's, I don't know, one of these what's the actual title? Design patterns, elements of reusable object-oriented software. And it's this text in in kind of software design. And that was on my bookshelf from having been a computer science student. And there was another one that I'm blanking on now. But yeah, I think this kind of pattern language inspired thing, like it's a concept I think people return to because it works. and it doesn't require you to read the whole thing to inspire or to develop. Oh, I take it back. I did just remember the other thing that I was connecting to, and it was Brian Eno's Oblique Strategies, which is a deck of cards for solving creative dilemmas. And you draw it. And my favorite one is honor thy error as hidden intention.
Very cool.
But yeah, that same kind of that random access component, I think, is actually like a key part of this, right? Being able to stumble upon a solution is a really powerful thing.
And also for me, it like opened up my eyes. So often when we are having problems with systems, with complex systems, like either we blame the tools or we blame the people. Often we don't really think about it like, oh, actually, yeah, that's why this room really doesn't work, because there's not enough lights. There's just this tiny little window, and the chairs are all in the wrong place, or that's why the cat always goes sit on that one chair. and when you then read through these patterns, it just, there's this hidden knowledge that we have about things that work and don't work in architecture. But then there's like realizing that there's similar things like that in social technical spaces. And then especially as tech writers who are documenting the affordances of all the tools that we're working with and trying to make it easier to find your way through this crazy Byzantine mess that organizations are making, that it's like, oh yeah, there's something similar happening here. Looking at then also thinking about what types of tools, not necessarily which tool, but what types of tools can help you with different patterns to go and improve things a bit. I had, before this podcast, I recorded one with Jeff Eaton, and we were also talking about pattern languages. And then we're talking about, it was about content management systems versus Doxys code. And then basically he did this, and I'm not sure who figured this out, but there's this cancerization in biology. Have you heard this?
Oh, yeah. Everything turns into a crab, right?
Yeah, everything turns into crab because there's this parallel evolution of everything turns into crab. And he was like, everything turns into a content management system. That was the digital equivalent of that, because if you start looking like the static site generators, little by little, you add more and more features, and it's a content management system now also. Yeah. So we were talking about that. But those patterns of what are the technical, what are the tools, and what are the practices, and what are the purposes, and how do these relate with each other, and which are the ones that fit well together, get you forward. That can be very inspiring. But yeah, cool stuff.
That's actually something that, like, part of what makes me so excited about this work is that I think part of it's just the job title, tech writer. Like, it does put you in a certain lane, but the nature of the work means you have to go around and talk to people all across the team that built that thing. Yeah. And so we are seeing those relationships in a certain kind of light, and one that is relatively close to our users, our customers. And as a tech writer, I don't have lots of opportunities to talk about that process of connecting those people across the team, and then connecting that to the artifacts that are going to serve our users. And I'm just very excited about ways to help us all work together, just because who has the time?
And it's especially with the whole AI hype wave that's going along and staying on the surface about the opinions on what direction it's flowing. But to make any of those systems useful, we need a lot more good documentation, because bad documentation or out-of-date documentation or bad documentation processes that result in not updated information is going to completely throw a wrench into that bandwagon. So yeah, so I think documentation is super, super important. We talked a little bit before we started recording about how the AI hype wave today is a little bit like the whole wiki wave, where there was this, oh, now we don't need tech writers anymore, because back with wikis, it was like, because everybody's going to become a writer and just edit stuff. And Yeah. I have this anecdote that I often tell to customers is that in the early days when I started talking with people about documentation systems, I asked them how they did documentation. They always said we have a wiki, the one with and starts with a C, and everybody, I can name it. Everybody has Confluence basically in large enterprise. And then I always ask like, so, do you like it? And then the result, everybody always said, actually, no, it really does not work. And there was one exception, which was a team where they actually had tech writers that were like cleaning up stuff and gardening the wiki, and they were really happy with it. It was just that the organizations that believed the hype that this thing was going to magically solve all the problems and you didn't have to spend any energy and effort on it anymore, they did not work. And I think something similar is going to happen with AI now, because the story is like this intelligence between quotation marks system is just going to magically consume all your support chats and then spit out perfect documentation, which is completely not what's going to happen.
I think of it as, I don't know, like a table saw or something, where like, if you know what you're doing, it can be really a powerful thing. But like personally, I'm like I'll admit to being like a little bit intimidated by like text generating AI, like the LLM, the generative kind of chat mode of AI, where it's like it produces a lot of text really quickly. And that is attractive. Like I absolutely see the appeal of it, but I also see it as like dangerous in the sense of wow, that's a tool so that I can make a lot of mistakes really quickly. And I think a lot, actually. I think because open source like kind of steers me in this way of thinking about what is the maintenance cost of this. Like when I'm looking at a pull request, I'm thinking about not just, is this the right thing for today, but what is going to have to happen to this in a year's time, in 5 years time, like, because I'm gonna see this again later, like kind of building up like that kind of cultural impulse, like to be like, oh yeah, how do I not just produce this for now, but like to hold on to it as something I get to keep for the future. But if your idea is of these tools is like, all right, I'm just gonna open the fire hose and stuff's gonna come out, like that's a good way to overwhelm yourself, to say nothing of like your actual users and readers.
Yeah, and it's the worst. So I had an experiment recently where I had a blog post and I asked one of the tools to generate me an outline based on it. And it looked like, first looked great. But then I started like really reading it like with full attention. I was like, I'm not sure, but I think I've already read this. And it's just a whole lot of work to then somehow iron it out so that it actually becomes a coherent whole again. So that was a really weird experience. So just throwing a big body of text into one of these systems, trying to build something out of it, does not work. You have to ask it like step by step. Now you have to figure out what is going to be your outline, then step by step ask, now in this concept, that is the logical next step. Please explain that to me, because otherwise it really doesn't work.
Yeah. That actually, I guess that reminds me of some of the experiences I've had with AI tools. One of the things I genuinely find them useful for is prompting myself to think about things better.
Yes.
And so asking the machine to ask me questions that I then have to answer is like that. I think that's really like fun exercise. And I think part about what makes that work is I do have a sense of what things should look like. So if I'm writing a blog post, if I'm writing a reference article, like if I'm doing those things, I've seen enough of them that I just have an intuitive sense of like how to make that have the right shape and to be a coherent whole, as you put it. And so I think something like that's, I think, going to be an increasingly important thing in a world where you can ask a chatbot to just give you stuff, is to help people recognize, at least at some basic level, of like, all right, here's like a vetted version of here's what a good essay looks like. It takes time. But like we can help people get there faster if we know that they're going to be relying on these tools. And I think maybe like these patterns is like a sort of like degree removed from that, where it's like, how would we organize ourselves to use tools or to collaborate with tools, right? For writers to work with LLMs and and engineers that are going to like be generating all kinds of stuff. And okay, how can they recognize each other's work? How can they cross-check each other? And that requires some level of familiarity. And so we have to like train each other up on how to recognize those things.
We need to discover what the affordances are of this new technology. And it's one of my favorite uses is, and this only works with ChatGPT on phone. The others, I've tried 4 others and they don't work. But where you, like when I'm thinking through something, like deep thinking, I record my thoughts and then it comes back with an answer. And it doesn't really matter what it writes, but it always spins up new ideas. And then you ask the next one and the next one. So now I do this like early morning. I'm sitting in the sofa with my coffee and just talking to the bots. And it really good stuff comes out and really helps advanced thinking. No matter the hype, it's not critical thinking, at least for now. There's so many hits and misses, or so many misses that before you have a good hit, that I'm worried that we've got a really powerful technology that's overhyped, and because of that, it's going to backfire. And the things that it would be useful for, we're not going to be able to do or people are not going to fund it because this was all BS and it didn't work anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard similar things. Something I've heard a couple times somewhat recently was this kind of suggestion that like I was like worry about that like harkening back to the .com bust, like 1999, 2000, like that kind of era of, oh yeah, we're gonna do all these things, we're gonna do everything on the internet, we're gonna like buy stuff on the internet, all this kind of thing, and then that didn't pan out. Except it did. It just a lot of dust had to settle before we got. I literally don't know anybody who doesn't buy some stuff online, right? And now we live in a world where that's just, we don't even think about that as like being a product of a hype cycle. It's just part of our economy now. And I suspect something like, I don't wish for disaster, right? But if that is like what we're headed toward, I don't think it's like going to be this like completely lost generation of stuff. It's just, it's going to take us time. Like actually, no matter what happens, it's going to take us time to find the genuinely good uses for technology like this. And I don't know, like it'll take time.
I think not jumping straight to, okay, it's just going to replace people and we're going to start firing people so that we have enough space for the bots to do stuff. But okay, what is something that it definitely can do? And then let's really focus in on that part. With the .com boom, all those investments in undersea cables, there were a huge boon once
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what funded the whole free internet for decades. But it's going to be interesting. To me, it feels like a utility similar to like electricity. So where electricity, you don't try to cook your chicken with electricity straight. That's just a really bad idea. That's not how it works. You have to plug the electricity into an oven and then that is going to cook your chicken. You need something that consumes this utility in a safe way that is actually going to pull out the utility and make it actually useful in a safe way and in a really much more productive way than if you just apply it directly. Like asking, and I know that there's what we're today calling AI is actually a bunch of products that are using LLMs under the hood, being specialized in a whole bunch of different ways. But interesting times for sure.
I like that appliance kind of metaphor of like with these kind of very energetic technologies. Like, you do need something that's like controllable and like operates at that scale that the operator needs to use it at.
There's a whole bunch of parallels, like the standard wars, when electricity first got rolled out, basically one of the first applications was arc lighting in cities or in villages, where you would have a power central like inside of like in situ, and you would like just make these arcs of electricity discharge to make lights, which is very interesting. Or like the Tesla coil and stuff like that. So really crazy stuff. And if you look back to it now, is what the hell were they playing with? And now electricity is just this really boring thing where you just plug something in and it can do anything. I think it's something like that. But this is a nice little bridge to the other topic I wanted to talk with you about, because in one of your previous jobs, you worked on the APIs that are powering the internet, and right, and how well they're standardized. And I wanted to zoom in on that a little bit, but can you explain it in your words?
So I have been doing, and I'm still doing some work with the W3C community group that's for WebDX. So it's like developer experience. And so this is like a cross industry group of like browser vendors, web developers, researchers, some other folks, and trying to basically improve our knowledge of what the developer experience is like for developers, and then translate that into tools that they can actually use. Like, we're not writing specifications for web APIs. We're not inventing new HTML elements. We're just trying to find ways to take the stuff that's already there and make it more useful. And so my part of this is this project called Web Features, which is taking this like very finely grained catalog of all the things that as a web developer that you can do. And I use web developer like very broadly here. Like, if you can use some HTML and CSS, like, you count. But like all those CSS properties and all the HTML elements and all the web APIs that do everything from playing a sound when you click a button to fetching some resource elsewhere on the web. If you take all those things, there's something in the neighborhood of 14,000 discrete like touch points for the web, right? When we talk about the web, there's 14,000 of these items. But the weird thing about the web is that it's like this abstract platform. Like, we talk about, oh, we're going to build a web app. We're going to build a website. But in practice, the way a web page actually works is that you're using your browser. So you're running Chrome or Firefox or Safari, and it's happening in that specific browser. And so when we talk about the web, we're really talking about the bits of the web that they all agree on, which is not 100% of those 14,000 things. And this project, Web Features, we've been trying to take those 14,000 things, put them into distinct feature identifiers so that we can say, yes, there's a feature called popover, so you can have a little element that gets overlaid on top of your other elements. Or there's an API for accessing MIDI devices, like for electronic instruments and stuff, right? And that's a feature. And we're trying to take all those and capture all those individual, like, of the thousands and thousands of things, which dozen of those belong to that feature. And then we are using that prior catalog. It's called browser compat data, which just records like which browsers support each of those things and since when. And we're capturing those into groups and computing a status for those things. And that status is called baseline. And so that shows up now on like places like MDN Web Docs. So there's these baseline banners that appear in places. There's can I use, and there's like a baseline indicator there as well. And that's, so it's this fascinating work because, one, we're combining developer perception about things. So we're using that research and knowledge about the web as a platform. Again, that abstract thing. And we're trying to make it concrete in terms of, okay, what is the true subset of the web that is like where the abstract is real? And then we're using existing data sources. So we're like building on top of this kind of structured information. And I don't know, like, now that I've like monologued through that for a bit, I think it's really interesting how, like, I'm through Web Features, I am connected to a sort of utility in the form of browser compat data. And it's, if you just look at the pure data for that, it's a fire hose. It's really overwhelming. The only way to really approach it is just to take one little piece of it and okay, now I know about this one little piece. And then, all right, now I'm going to move to the next little piece and try to understand that one. And so by combining these things and aggregating them, that's a really powerful thing. And now I've turned that into, I say me, but me and my collaborators, we have turned those pieces into smaller, more manageable chunks. And so that itself has now become a utility, because now there's the baseline banner, that's the home appliance for web developers, right? That is the thing they get to plug into. Where, can I use this on my website or not? Like, yes or no. But we're doing that at a pretty, like, it's mostly at an informational level at this point. There is some work. I know some folks are developing tools that actually integrate that into other tools like your editor and things like that developers are using. But it is interesting. I had not thought of that before as this kind of utility formation that is going on there. And that's really cool. But it's also fascinating because it's happening under this umbrella of the web, which is itself also a utility. And so it's an exciting thing to be working on. And as a writer, like I'm just like connecting bits of information together. And it's like almost this purely structured thing. Like I'm doing very little writing of my own in this, but I'm building tools that support other writers. Yeah. And so I don't know, I feel like it connects well with the other things we've talked about here, where there's a lot of these big overwhelming tools, and it is on us to turn them into things that that there's real handles to grab onto.
It's interesting because then this is actually like an inverted utility, because most utilities that we know or that we think about are things where there's a central authority that is controlling the production sites, and that is super uniform, and then the consumption sites is very diverse. Electric appliances, it's the appliances where the diversity is, but here it's the other way around, because it's the content that is being served to your browser, and there's not that many browsers that needs to be compatible with the devices that are supposed to be consuming it. So that was really interesting. It made me think, what you were just describing made me also think about standards like CAMARA, MEF in telecommunication, or the PSD2 regulation in banking, where there have been standards, or there are standards, but then they are implemented in slightly different ways, because of which you get a soup, and then you have to somehow try to figure out if it all works together or not. So that sounds a lot like, but then probably much larger still than in that space.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, there's like waste to not waste as in like excess, but like waste is in like a narrow point where we've got like the browser is where a lot of those constraints happen to help us to decide like, all right, this is how this thing can work. And even though there's a specification that says like the browser is supposed to implement this or that, but like in practice, like there's limitations that like, the browsers can only implement can't implement everything. There's only so many hours in the day. There's also just limitations of performance and ergonomics, right? What can developers actually practically use? And that all happens in a browser. But I'd be remiss if I did not mention the sort of shadow version of, it's easy actually to think of the web as being like what happens inside a browser. But there is also, I think APIs are like the other side of this, where it doesn't exercise as much of the web as a platform as the rest, but there's at that level, there's even fewer, the browser's constraints influence what those look like, but they're not actually being routed through the browser. It's just, it has to coexist with the browser. And so you have these APIs that do all kinds of interesting things, but there's a huge diversity there as well. And I don't know, it's very half-baked thought at this point, but like I'm thinking about this utility view of the web. And so some of there's a shadow utility as well, right? Where, or maybe it's like the backhaul of telecom, right? Where like you pick up your phone, you make a call, like, okay, that's an appliance, but there's also these big sort of almost industrial scale uses. And I think APIs are like in that world. And it's interesting to me, I don't know, I'm still trying to connect this to, it hasn't fully congealed here, but like if I'm doing web development work and I want to use an API to achieve something, like it's often that I know how the JavaScript that I'm going to write to consume that API looks. I know how to write that code, but the API itself, has domain knowledge that I'm maybe not completely clear on and things like that. And I see the attraction there of the AI coding tools to go like, all right, I'm going to reach the point of my confident knowledge and then connect to this. And right now, because there's no real consistency across APIs, it's like that's not an appliance type connection, right? That is, I'm having to do that industrial interconnection. Yes. And that's an area like where, I don't know, it's still unclear to me like how we can make that kind of thing better for developers.
I think that or the way I see LLMs and I'll call it generative. I think that they're the enabling technology for APIs that today are products to become a utility, a true utility, where you don't need to have people hand wiring stuff together. A good friend, Nemetz from Superface, his company, Superface, got started on the premise that it doesn't make any sense that you have to hand wire APIs together. So that he used to do presentations about the telephone, how in the early days of telephony, you had the Cable Girls, the television series, people that would say, hello, okay, you want to talk to this person? Okay, let me plug into this, to the right connector, so that you can go to the next person who can ask you who you want to be connected to. And so this is actually what we're doing today as developers. Like we're hand wiring these connections between systems together. This doesn't make any sense. And he was working on a solution for that before LLMs. And then he made a pivot to actually start using LLMs for the same thing. I think this is where APIs become a true utility. Now the question is, are we going to use the REST API standard or any of the existing standards like together with this enabling technology to make this work, or how this is going to work exactly? That's going to be an interesting thing to see. But yeah, the industrialization of digital interfaces. And I think to bring it all back together, I think that technical writers have this essential role to play in the enablement of the connections. That without proper documentation, without actually doing this well, that just auto-generating docs only gets you so far. That if you want to have the least faulty connections, you will need to work with technical writers to do this well, because otherwise you're just going to spend a lot of money on compute and on lots and lots of API calls, and then all the problems that like faulty calls bring. Yeah, because I think most organizations, they're not ready to have 100 times more API calls just because somebody on the other end is trying to get their LLM to do the right call. Because that is actually what potentially could happen right now. So if you really start scaling LLMs doing API traffic,
I don't know. You've gotten me like a very like reflective mood now about. I feel like when I've like through my career, like especially early on in my career, I had partly it was just some quirks of like how I got started, but it was like, oh yeah, like generating documentation. That's how. Oh, we're gonna write some code and then we're gonna generate some documentation, and that's how I'm going to write a lot of stuff without having to write a lot of stuff. And then later on, it becomes more about, oh, I'm gonna develop a process with my colleagues that's going to enable me. And so I'm going to have other people help me write the docs, like that kind of docs as code model. And now I'm thinking like even wider of like, all right, it's not just enough for me to have better tools to generate documentation. It's not just enough for my team to like work a little bit better about documentation. Like we need this like a wider, I need the whole organization, I need the whole industry to be better about documentation if we're going to actually solve some of these like bigger challenges of if we're going to open up that fire hose, if we're going to actually manage that and manage that well, then if you can't just go, okay, we're going to have a few people write some docs. That's not going to be the story.
Even so, a lot of organizations with the whole AI thing thought, oh, it can write, so I guess we can get rid of our writers. And
I joke with people, I'm not worried about an LLM taking my job. I'm worried about people believing an LLM can take my job.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because to describe the affordances of the tools, to first discover it the first time, and it becomes much easier to share the possible uses of a tool across organizational boundaries when you have this model that's cross-talking between organizations, if you let it. But that first use still needs to be done. Yeah, you could go and try a zillion things, of course. But yeah, like documenting this, what is actually the utility of certain aspects, and then constraining that so that it becomes useful, safe, efficient. I think that's really important to have people there that can think in a structured way about how we do things. Yeah.
In my work on mapping the web platform, I found lately that actually a lot of the questions I need to answer involved digging into the past, doing some software archaeology, and finding out why these things came to be. That, yeah, I can test the API, I can find out what it does, I can find its like material effects, but like to actually tell a story about that thing, it comes back to the motivations of the people involved and what did they want this tool, this product to achieve.
Daniel, is there anything you would like people to go have a look at from your work or from adjacent things?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, if folks go to my website, it's ddbeck.com. And like
Beck is CK, right?
Yes. ddbeck.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. I rarely send email, but if you want to get when the full set of documentation archetypes is out there in the world, I'll send you a link to that. You can also find links to social sites where I'm on Blue Sky and Mastodon and LinkedIn and stuff. Yeah, if you want to follow along on the things I'm learning, I've been trying to get back into the kind of maybe old school blogging mentality of just trying to like kind of keep, I learned something interesting today. So I've been trying to do more of that in kind of bite-sized pieces. Yeah, if you want to hear about some interesting web stuff or whatever, that's going to be a good place to follow along and to have a conversation with me. I would love to hear from folks about how they are confronting these great communications problems.
Is there anything people can hire you for? What are the kind of jobs that you're interested in doing?
So I'm really interested in helping folks use that open source documentation contribution model. I think I think a thing that I'm good at is helping folks figure out where they are in that journey of, are we ready to hire a writer? Do we need a heavier documentation process for our public-facing open source code? What would that look like? I think orienting folks to figure out what is the level of investment they need is something I'm keen to help with.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you very much, Daniel. As always, great pleasure to be talking with you. And we went a couple of places that I didn't realize that we would end up. So it's really cool. I had a great time. And yeah, hope to see you soon at one of the next occasions.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really interesting conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you, Daniel. That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com. And thank you for listening.